Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we are talking about what each of the 9 types looks like when their self-preservation instinct is repressed.
Yeah, I like this one. And Bea, we are doing
I
now
knew
the
you would.
podcast. Yeah, I like talking about repressed instincts. Now, it's nicer to be doing these podcasts looking at you on video.
Yes.
I hope our interaction gets even better.
Yes, whatever that means.
Okay, yeah, and most of our listeners are probably listening to us right now in a podcast platform, but this is now also available on our YouTube channel, the Chestnut Pies Enneagram Academy YouTube channel. So check it out if you want.
Yeah, but we're still
Yeah,
getting used to video, we should say, maybe.
and you are always concerned with how you
Of
look on
course.
video and
Of
so
course.
forth. Yeah.
Being a type and you aren't.
Yeah, and you are looking really good.
Oh, thanks. So are you. And it's nice that you changed out of your t-shirt into a different, a proper
Yeah,
shirt.
yeah, just for the podcast. Okay,
Yeah, I know.
so how do you want to start?
Well, maybe let's talk a little bit, say something short about what we mean when we say a repressed instinct and what we mean generally when the self-preservation instinct is repressed. And then let's talk about the
Yeah,
9 types.
yeah, you're always very organized and more planned because you're self-pressed dominant and I'm self-pressed repressed. All right,
That's
so
right. So we
yes,
won't be
so you
talking
want.
about me today. We'll be talking about you, though.
Wow,
Yes.
that's dangerous. Okay, good.
And this is one of the traits of the self-pres dominant is being more orderly and structured, but I think that makes for better understanding. Maybe.
I get the indirect message to me. Yeah, okay. And the,
Okay.
and the competition going on here. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Yeah.
good. So, how do you describe what a repressed instinct is and what a self-pres repressed instinct is?
Well, this is something we emphasize when we teach the instincts. And again, the instincts are that aspect of our personality for all of us. That's really the survival brain part of us. That part of our personality that reflects our animal wisdom or our animal intelligence. That helps us survive in the world by letting us know when we're in danger or when we have a biological need. However, in humans, our instincts tend to overfunction or underfunction. And what we find is that while all of us have all 3 instincts, the instincts for self preservation, and these are kind of groupings of instincts or particular drives or focuses of instincts, one sort of instinct is for self preservation. And we see this in the people that we work with. It's for a focus, it puts the focus a little more on what do I need to survive? Do I have enough resources? Do I have enough safety? Do I feel comfortable and like I'm not going to be threatened? And if I am threatened, I'll be able to do something about it. So it's a little more self-focused.
Mm-hmm.
The social instinct being more, focused on the group or the herd or the tribe, and the one-to-one or the sexual instinct being much more focused on bonding deeply with specific individuals, fusing with particular individuals. And all of these support survival, of course. But today we'll focus on the self-preservation instinct and what happens when it's repressed. And one of the things we talk a lot about is that we believe that we have a sequence. Sometimes it's called a stack. We like to call it a sequence because a stack sounds like a stack of books. It sounds like something that's very static and fixed. And while the sequence or the stack can be fixed until we really do a lot of work to shift it, um, these are biological energies, and so they're almost more in dialectical tension with each other. It's almost more like they show up in a sequence. Like one tends to take up more space, one can come online at other times. The second one that we say, it's in sort of the secondary. It's tends more toward normality. It's easier to shift, but it's not dominating the experience. But it's there to an extent. And then there's one that is sometimes called by other Enneagram teachers and authors a blind spot. And we call it repressed because these are energies, these are biological energies. And in our psyche, when something is out of consciousness, it's often repressed. In other words, we are, without realizing it, putting energy into keeping something out of our consciousness.
Mhm.
So repressed is an important word for us when it comes to this third instinct because it's often really not there. It's just not on the radar screen.
Mhm. Yeah, good introduction. So one thing we also explain at times of why we think it's repressed on top of being a blind spot is because we have somewhat of a more active force to go against that. It's not only not seeing something, it's at times making sure that that does not manifest for other reasons. Now, some people ask us if, why do we talk about an instinctual sequence, a repressed, if in thesis the instinct that is required in a specific life moment gets activated because of that life moment of what's happening in life. So isn't it like that? People ask. And so here's the answer, my answer at least, see what you think. When we are in personality, and we're definitely in personality as our limited self when we are coming from instinct, we are not in touch with reality. We are not seeing things that are truly happening out there. We're running them through our filters. And therefore, no, the instinct does not fully react to the actual situation that's going on. Like for a self-pres repressed, and we're going to talk about self-pres repressed today. If the person loses a job, that's a concerning situation. If the person is getting out of money in the bank account, it's a concerning situation. But in practice, many self-pres repressed people take a lot of time to react to that kind of situation. So people are not really in touch with what's happening out there because they are doing what Gurdjieff called inner considering and not outer considering, seeing the situation for what it really is. It's biased because of that sequence. So it's just to a certain extent that people allow the instinct to go up because life is requiring so, not totally. And one last thing I want to say is that the repressed instinct, whatever that is, for each of us, does bring us specific behavioral traits and some characteristics of who we are in life and how we come across also at times. And because many times Enneagram teachers do not talk much about the repressed instinct, some generalizations about types are made that some people don't relate to. It really depends on what the repressed instinct is. So while the dominant instinct is essential, and also the subtype dimension that comes a little bit with that, the repressed instinct is also something to be considered. And it's super important to do work on that. But I think that today our intention is to say more how the nine types look like, right? When they have the self-pres repressed.
Right. What they look like. Yeah, exactly. And how uh, a person of a particular type might look different than people of that same type because their self preservation instinct is repressed. And we might say that, of course, we'll do other episodes on what the nine
Mm.
types look like when the social instinct is repressed or when the sexual instinct is repressed. But today we're focusing on self preservation repressed, which I have to say, some people might find the most fun because self preservation repressed people are really funny because they
Oh.
sometimes do crazy things.
Mhm.
I think the stories that self preservation repressed people have that describe what that means for them are often humorous. Let's put it that way.
They're usually more adventurous. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
or yes, or really daring. I remember. I don't think we should repeat it here, but at our last retreat, as a
I
way
know the
of
case you're going to mention. Yeah.
demonstrating what the self preservation instinct when it's repressed looks like, we had one of our participants tell a story of a trip she took, and it was amazing, really
A
amazing.
trip to go to the retreat, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The trip she took to go to the retreat. And so, but maybe we can tell a few stories if they occur to us as we go today. But it's often, it's what happens when people really, it's like, it's just totally not on their radar screen to worry about their self-care needs or their safety or things like that. Sometimes it ends up being a bit, shocking.
Mm. I've just two questions to you before we go ahead with the nine types. When you say that self-pres repressed are funny, do you mean that I'm funny?
Yes, I guess so. But I'm also thinking of other stories we've heard about other people, usually at our retreats, telling kind of like, I remember there was a woman in Brazil who told kind of a crazy story about an experience she had at Carnival there. And in Rio de Janeiro, they have a big, event every year. It's a giant parade, all night party, as only the Brazilians can do. And her story of what happened to her there was, you know, really interesting. Let's put it that way. But yes, you're funny. Definitely, that's a big part of
Good.
it. That's
Good. So,
knowing you're one of the people I know that the best that is self preservation repressed.
okay. And second question, are you saying that I'm funnier than you?
Well, if leaving your phone in Ubers and leaving your suitcase at home when you go to the airport is funny, then yes, you're funnier than me.
Okay, good. Fair enough. So let's start. Let's talk about eights. Eights with self preservation repressed. Do you want to start?
Why don't you start?
Okay. So I think that eights with self pres repressed, first of all, they become really naive. Um, we'll have a top five today talking about naivete and the types, but eights, I think, have a tendency to be naive, but self-pres repressed eights more so, in my view. And another thing is they, um, when self-pres is repressed, there is a quality that doesn't get to be being clumsy or being inattentive to things because they are body types, but they are definitely not as connected to processes and details as some other, not only eights, but body types are. And one last thing is that self-pres repressed eights are really people who pay attention to others more than to themselves, because there is a quality of eights of sort of being generous people and being concerned with being fair and so on. Not all eights are like that. You know, there are other instinctual sequences that uh, don't make the eight be exactly like that, but it's a general tendency. And when self-pres is repressed, and especially if social's dominant, then it's a lot about the other and being there for the other. But what would
Mhm.
you say if you agree, or what would you add?
Yeah, I would add that, eights are part of what we sometimes call the self forgetting triad of types. That is eight, nine, and one already. So often eights, because they tend to be bold and doing things out in the world, they don't always take care of their self care needs. It's a little bit like not tuning into what they might need physically, what they might need in order. It's a little bit having to do with the denial of sensitivity also, I think, or vulnerability. It's like I'm not looking at myself in as a vulnerable being,
Mm,
both like emotionally but also physically.
yeah.
Like working too hard, and so eights are already a little bit like that. And so I think
Mhm,
this, when self-preservation is repressed in an eight, they're even more like that. Like
mhm,
really not tuning into what they need physically, like not taking care of not getting sick, or if they get sick, they don't really take care of themselves, like injuring themselves because they do things in a big way and don't really take care to notice if they hurt themselves or if they might hurt themselves. So I think there's that sense of putting themselves in danger or not really calibrating or even discerning the dangers out there, whether it's like getting sick if you do something, or having an accident, or your bodily physically needs not being really something that you pay attention to. So when I think of self-preservation repressed in eights, I think of that. And also just, again, doing things that might be dangerous that you don't see as
mhm,
dangerous.
yeah, yeah, because there is a bold feature for AIDS in general. But yeah, and I think you're super right on this last thing. And I always hear stories from mates that are usually like this. I was practicing a sport and I broke a bone and I didn't feel at the moment. And I think
Right.
that is more common for self-pres repressed AIDS. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
what about nines?
So self-preservation repressed nines. Why don't you start again? I think
Okay.
you're good
Okay.
at these.
Okay, so I think that they become really clumsy and they feel totally disconnected from their bodies, although they are body types. They are extremely distracted. They are
Mhm.
also the exaggeration of not paying attention to self, which is
Mhm.
already a tendency for nines in general, and
Mhm.
even harder to talk about self with others. And
Mhm.
finally, I think that self-press repressed nines are extra um, available for other
Mhm.
people. They are always there, and people can count on them too much, for them.
Mhm.
It's a double self-forgetting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like forgetting themselves even more, losing track of themselves, their physical needs, the need to be alone, the need to, put time into things that have to do with self interest, sort of healthy self interest, and being overly focused on what's going on out there, having their attention be pulled out to the environment even more and more of the time. and not say recognizing when it might be feel good to be alone, or focus on much an even harder time focusing on their own priorities, on knowing what those are,
Yeah.
making time for them, making sure those kinds of things happen, and then potentially really um, giving away their energy
Mm.
even
Yeah.
more to other people, being way too available, way too adaptable. Um, I think it's funny because sometimes every once in a while, I interview a nine who says they're not stubborn, and I have a feeling that I mean, and I think it's also a blind spot. I think those
Yeah.
nines that say they're not stubborn are stubborn. They just aren't seeing it. But I think sometimes those are the self preservation repressed nines. It's
Yeah.
almost like they don't go, because nines, have that aspect of them where they kind of go against, and
Hmm.
sometimes the go against looks like, just digging their heels in, or not taking action, or not making a decision. And I think it can be a little bit, they can be less stubborn in a way that's conscious,
Yeah.
because they're sort of going too much with other people's flow and other people's agenda, and it's even harder to have their own agenda.
Yes. Yes. And I'm remembering that in the past I worked with a self-pres repressed nine, and she had these stories that other people would take advantage of her so much that I would be pissed off at her, really, because I liked
Mhm.
her a lot, but she couldn't change
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
and I think that's yet another tendency.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
maybe we should talk about ones now. So I
Yes.
think that ones, when self-pres is repressed, they don't fit the more stereotyped description of ones as being
Mhm.
perfectionistic, and
Yeah.
it's about other kinds of drive for perfection, not being detail oriented necessarily, although they can still be because they are ones, but not, it's not the main feature at all that they have.
Mhm.
Another thing is that they are not that self-critical. It's being self-critical as a one, but not in that very exaggerated way that self-pressed ones are. They are a bit more critical either of the environment or others in their lives. And it's funny because I did a session today with a person who's an executive, and she is a self-pres repressed one, social
Hmm.
dominant, and
Hmm.
it was super interesting for me to see how she is someone who's always available for other people and playing nice and being really there for them as a growth stretch, not because she's self-pres repressed in that case. But then she does that out of pure self-forgetting, and she does everything for their employees and not much for her at all. And then for her son, she does a lot for her son, but really not for herself, and so forth. So it can be also very imbalanced, how much they pay attention to others and to self, although that's not a chief feature of ones in general.
Mhm.
And one last thing is that these ones have a tendency, I don't see that always, but a tendency to be extra fun. Ones can be very fun, but
Mhm.
self-pres repressed ones have a paradoxical side to them of being like more spontaneous, more, you know, people who joke around or who are happier, in general. And I think there is um, some connection to being self-pres repressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking, you know, I don't think I know very many ones in my life that are self-pres repressed. Um, or I don't know if they are, and they don't stand out to me as being that way. But as I'm thinking about this, my sense is that these are the ones that, like you said exactly, they don't fit the stereotype of what we sometimes think of ones as being really fastidious or methodical. They're a little more out of the box. Now, I think if the person is a sexual dominant one, that I think the sexual dominant one with self preservation repressed, I think that's the one that looks the most like the eight,
Mhm.
because I think sexual ones
Yeah,
look a lot like eights anyway. But I do think that there are some sexual ones that are more what I would call like polite or smiley. They sometimes come off as being two-ish. They're also kind of holding themselves back a lot. I think those are the ones where they have self-preservation second and social repressed. But I think that the self-preservation repressed ones are a little bit more um, saying what they think, a little bit more less cautious
hmm,
about like being opinionated, and putting that opinion out there. And I think they have maybe a bigger energy in the world, and so I think there are people who are maybe a little more focused on how they see things and not being too careful to worry about other people as well,
interesting.
or
Good points.
what their impact is. You know,
Mm. Okay, should we talk about choose, starting the heart triad?
sure, yeah,
See what you think. I believe that self-pres repress choose are the most exaggerated in doing for others,
mm,
which is a somewhat a tendency for choose in general, but then it becomes more exaggerated, less
mm,
connected to themselves, their own stuff and emotions, even less so. And
mm,
it's not that the other choose that are not self-repressed are connected to their emotions. I'm not talking being connected to emotions or not. It's about their
yeah,
priorities, maybe, or needs in
mm,
general. And also, they tend to be really funny, really nice people, which I must say, in the nice part, it's not really a compliment because I think that choose when they grow, they need to become less nice. And that's
mm,
what is supposed to happen if they are doing psycho spiritual work. But I think
mm,
that self pres repress choose are extra nice, sympathetic, and
mm,
always available and accommodating. I think is a good word to describe how I
mhm,
see self pres
mhm,
repress choose. And the self pres repress choose that I know, they they have an extra tendency to not saying when there is trouble in their lives, not sharing that with others, and not asking for help when they need the most, and just not allowing others to see sometimes the very bad things that may be happening with them. But what do you
right.
think?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think even less focus on themselves and getting what they need, asking for help. Although asking for help is hard for all of us, even as self-preservation dominants. I think sometimes I think of them as more out there, like more expressive of their emotions,
Mm-hmm.
more expressive of, if they're social too, of their opinions, and a little more bossy,
Mm-hmm.
um, less restricted. There's less holding them back from expressing whatever it might be that they're feeling. Whether it's excitement or anger or opinions. It's like they're I think with the self preservation instinct in twos, it's a little bit like it's, even me, I can be, sometimes I can, like, let's say, be at a party and afterward I can feel like, ooh, I think I was a little bit too expressive or too excited or too enthusiastic, or like I lose myself and I go out there. But I think with the self-preservation instinct in twos, it's like a counter force kind of holding you back, cards a little bit closer to the vest, a little bit more fearfulness and worry about what people will think. I think with the self-preservation repressed two, they're a little bit looser. They don't think twice about doing something. They just go do it, maybe more action oriented. And that's another thing I would say. Sometimes I hear about twos that they're really active in like helping people or that kind of thing. And I think sometimes I kind of hang back and think, do I want to help that person? Maybe not.
Mhm.
And maybe I'll find a way to avoid helping someone,
Mhm.
by flying under the radar or withdrawing or acting like I don't know what's going on. Whereas I think that the self-preservation repressed too is much more out there, active, moving into action really quickly, helping without limit, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think it's a dangerous territory that I'm going into now, but I think that self-pres repressed Jews tend to be more extroverted, even more than
Yeah.
the average Jew. Although I know at least one self-pres repressed Jew that says she is introverted, only that nobody else agrees with that, you know. But
Right.
I
Right.
think that there is some degree of correlation between the level of the self-pres instinct and introversion and extroversion. Like for me, I'm a self-pres repressed five, and in tests of other types, not Enneagram, I rank as being extroverted,
Yeah.
including Myers-Briggs. And I think that twos become more exaggerated extroverts and being out there and even outspoken, in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. A slight detour to say what I think about introversion. I think that people overestimate themselves as introverts because there's a misunderstanding about what an introvert is, that I think some people think it's needing time alone.
Yeah.
Like I need time alone to recharge. I think everybody needs time alone to recharge. And I think what happens with twos is because we sort of give so much of ourselves when we're with people, there's almost inevitably a backlash of I need a lot of time alone to kind of find myself again and get more connected with myself. I can't connect with myself unless I'm alone. And so I just wanted, that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think that might be
Mhm.
interesting because I really agree with you, what you're saying. I think that the extroverted tendency is more with the self-preservation repressed. We haven't mentioned so far what you sometimes talk about in I think a way that's very interesting, which is that some self-preservation repressed people, the shadow is almost a suicidal tendency.
Mhm.
So it's almost like putting yourself in danger or even like opening up to self-harm. And I wonder if with twos, and again, we may want to think about this with the types we still have to cover, if there's a way, like, how twos can like get involved with people who aren't good for them.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Like they with say an addict, like I'm going to save the addict, or I'm going to, or
Yeah.
like, so I've heard too say I get attracted to fixer uppers. If there's
Mm.
almost that tendency of throwing yourself away on certain people who don't give you what you need, or being with people who actually, really aren't so good for you, but you don't see it for a long time. I mean, I've done that a little bit in my life, but then I sort of have, sort of withdrew from that tendency somewhat pretty early in my life.
Yes, yes. Good point. And you just made me think of someone I know who might be doing exactly that. Anyway,
Mhm.
let's move on. Let's talk
Yeah.
about threes, shall we?
Yes. Yes.
So, self-preservation repressed threes are really about image and not as much about goals and tasks. It's not the chief feature to have goals and
Mhm.
tasks, although it's still there. They are threes, but it's
Right.
not what prevails. it's much more like how I am being seen, and they are
Mm-hmm.
not as pragmatic as some threes are. It's a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
in my view, to say that all threes are pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they are terrible in time management, in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Not, I mean, it's not exactly that. It's not time management, sorry. It's more like they talk too much and they are late for things. Their
Mm-hmm.
punctuality, but they still have a drive to be productive. Believe me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not. They don't control time as much as the other threes. You know, they
Mm-hmm.
still try to fit in a lot in every hour, but they are not disciplined, let's say. And this is probably the least uh, process oriented of all threes. It's
Mm-hmm.
really more about results, because not having goals doesn't mean not being result oriented. You can still be
Mm-hmm.
result oriented without clear goals. And again, it's relative. As a three, this will still have goals, but it's more like I'm I'm um, I'm creating a goal that I know more or less when should happen and what exactly I should achieve. It's not that specific or rigid as it is for
Mm-hmm.
some other threes. And finally,
Mm-hmm.
this three finds it a bit easier to listen to other people than other threes. They are a little bit more out there for others. But what do you
Mm-hmm.
think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I think out there for others can also mean really, uh, like you said, being a lot about image, a lot about what other people want me to be, and a little bit more out there in the world, almost more actively. Um, being who others want them to be, you know, and not as much sort of focused on material security, but more on what things look like, the appearance of success, the excitement of success, the the thrills and the benefits of success that are more about like doing things in the world or
Yeah.
being the image of someone who's exciting and that kind of thing. Whereas I think the self preservation dominant instinct in this case in threes is a lot about sort of putting your head down, you know, just sort of
Hmm.
focusing on the work that you have to do.
Yeah.
It's
Get
not
down to
so much,
business. Yeah.
yeah, they're more modest. They're more focused on, we were talking earlier about one type that isn't so concerned, say, about money or something. If you're repressed, well, self-preservation dominance, and especially self-preservation dominant threes, like worry about money even when they don't have to. So it's a
Hmm.
little bit the
Hmm.
opposite of that. Not so worried about, how much, calculating how much is in the bank, but more just out there, making things happen in a big way, and wanting to feel the rush of excitement of that,
Hmm.
of making things happen, impressing people, looking
Yeah.
good, and not so much in terms of well-being focus.
Hmm. Yeah, true. And one last comment from me. I think that self-pres repressed threes, together with self-pres repressed nines, are the types the least in touch with themselves on the Enneagram. For
Hmm.
threes, I think that sexual dominant with self-pres repressed would be that the least in touch with self.
Right.
When it's more difficult to look inside. This is what I mean.
Yes. 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 Yeah. 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 Hard to know how you're feeling or connect to yourself at a deeper level. Yeah. And again, even when that's not good for you, that's
Hmm.
detrimental to your health. Yeah, and
Right.
to your emotional health as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is a blind spot, as we called it in the beginning. Yeah. So force. Um,
Fours.
so I think that self-pres repressed force have an interesting paradox inside them. They they on one hand they are self-referencing, but on the other hand they are not. It's like from an emotional perspective that they are always coming back to self, but energy wise and instinctive wise, they're going out there to others and losing touch with themselves. So it's a paradox. Is this person really self referencing or other referencing? It's sometimes hard to say. And I think that this four stays a little bit more outside than other fours. We say that fours in general spend almost all their lives in their inner world, but I think that somehow the self-pres repressed four is a bit more out there, not as much inside. Another thing is this person has really hard time being grounded. I think that the two types on the bottom of the Enneagram's diagram, 4 and 5, have a harder time being grounded in general, right? It's about things related to the Enneagram symbol in itself. But then when it's self-pres repressed, they have this tendency to be really in the clouds and not here down. They are not down to earth at all, at all. And there is an even bigger lack of pragmatism for these people, and idealism goes really high. But what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think of this for the self preservation repressed for as being the more dramatic for, maybe a little melodramatic, like a little bit more. Sometimes, I mean, I think fours get stereotyped by this, so I don't want to overdo it, but more drama, a little more drama, um, more moody, and people know about it. People know about your moodiness,
Hmm.
more self-expressed,
Hmm.
even
Yeah.
if that's something that's going to get you in trouble.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like we say, I really note, especially from my days as a psychotherapist, how fours tend to understand what's going on at a deeper level. They kind of have this emotional intuition about there's something we're not talking about, and sort of like being truth tellers, even when that's going to get them in trouble, and especially when that's going to get them in trouble, like bringing out the truth that people don't want to hear and kind of pushing it in their face. And even when that means people push them away or reject them or get angry with them or make them bad, that there's a tendency to not be able to stop doing that. Now it's a little
Hmm.
bit tricky for fours because, of course, the self preservation for can be someone who puts themselves in danger more as a kind of a masochism, which is a blind spot for them. But I think there is also a self preservation for dynamic, that there's some fear there and some holding things in there that the self preservation repressed for doesn't have as much. It's more, they're more out
Yeah.
there with stuff, and it's more expressing oneself because you can't hold it back,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
More like open book when it comes to
Yes.
emotions and so forth. Yeah.
Right, 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 right.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Maybe a
So
little also
finally, yeah.
more moving toward conflicts.
Yes.
Sometimes
Yes.
maybe
Maybe jump.
unwise conflicts, creating
Yeah.
conflicts that don't need to happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
So
I met you
finally, we'll
even
talk
another
about
moment. Yeah,
fives. Yay,
fives.
fives.
Yes,
Woohoo. Yeah.
yes.
So
So
I am a
tell us your
self-pres.
story.
I
Yes.
am a self-pres repressed five, yes. So I think the problem with grounding is big. I think I had to work harder than other people to have the experience of grounding. Now I do, and but that was very difficult in the beginning of my path. I'm still extremely idealistic and not pragmatic, as you well know. And I think there is a bigger lack of practicity for fives who are self-pres repressed.
I'm not sure
Uh,
practicity is a word. So
oh,
do you mean,
interesting. Oh, yeah. It has to
you
do
mean
with just saying what comes, and the self-pres repressed in
making up
me. Yeah,
words?
yeah,
Yeah.
yes. Okay. Yeah, being bold and thinking that I can speak English, right? Yeah. Okay.
You
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, I think in general there is a lot of self confidence for
Yeah.
self repressed people. But what would be the other word for practicity? Because I'm sure you understood what I mean, what I meant.
Yeah. Not very practical, you know.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Someday I'll change the English dictionary, you know. But yeah, what else? The self-pres repressed five. I think I think there is a paradoxical thing of, looking at self and wanting space for self, but also being there for others all the time. So in my life, I've always dedicated a lot of time for others. And even if you look at my astrological chart, what they tell me always, the astrologers that I've talked with, is that my chart is all above other people, all about other people, and not about myself. Um, so I think there is this paradox, because on one hand, fives are trying to guarantee their own, uh, you know, time and space and energy, but on the other hand, you are there for others quite often, and always, and many times, doing things. I used to do that a lot. I had to learn how not to, but I used to do lots of things for free, for other people. So
Mm.
there is this thing that is a detachment coming from the five ego, from
Yeah. Right.
resources, including money, but then, and the minimalism of fives, and I don't need that, that fives usually
Mm.
experience. But at the same time,
Hmm.
they do that going for others and dedicating time. So it's paradoxical.
Hmm.
But what else do you
Right.
see in me? I'm sure you can talk about many of my flaws.
Right. Well, I could, but I won't.
Uh-huh.
Not very
Okay.
many.
Good. Yeah. Good
Well, it's
girl.
funny
Yes.
because one of the reasons why I'm glad we're talking about this topic in general is it helps us get away from stereotypes. I think a
Mm.
lot of people stereotype the five as the self preservation dominant
Yes.
five.
Very true.
And
Yeah.
if it's someone like you that's self preservation repressed, there's so many things about you that don't look like the typical five. And I remember when
Yeah.
we were on the board of directors of the International Enneagram Association together,
Yeah.
people at conferences, people were always telling you or me that you
Mm.
weren't really a five. Right. And I
Right.
think it's
Yeah.
because of this.
Yeah. But also because
I
I'm
think it's,
Brazilian. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, yeah, that's a big part of it too as well. But more expressive, I think.
Mm. Yeah.
Not as much holding things in. Now, I think when it comes to needing time by yourself, that's just as much as other fives. Now, again, like you said, because you're generous with your time, sometimes you might not end up getting as much time by yourself as you want, and that won't feel good for you. But you let yourself be pushed into that more than say a self-preservation five who will have a
Mm.
boundary and won't let
Yeah.
people
For
cross it,
sure.
right?
Mm.
Much stronger boundary. It's like, no, that won't happen, that you'll sort of take advantage of me or take more time from me that I want to give you. With you, I think that happens, and partly because you are focused on the outside world a lot, both in terms of current events and politics, but also people, like you're
Mhm.
saying, and interested in people and interested in that. And it's like that brings you out of that sort of the focus that's more even more internal for the self-preservation dominant five. I do
Hmm.
think there's with you, let's talk a little bit about you. I think one of the reasons why we have so many stories, like I remember one time we were meeting at a hotel on the East Coast. You were flying in from London, I flew in from California, and I like met you in the lobby. Then the first thing you said to me was, I just realized I forgot my phone in the taxi. Right,
Yeah.
right. That's a common occurrence.
Yeah.
Or the time
Last
you left
time
your
I went,
suitcase.
my last time I went to California, I left my laptop in the security of the
Right,
airport,
at
and
the
I had
airport.
to stay all the time in California without my laptop, and I got it when I went back. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. So and what I think is going on there is it's a little bit like other fives, your head is sort of thinking about things. It's a little bit like what we say, your head is in the clouds
Yeah.
and not so much in your body and on the ground, you know? And
Yes.
and it's similar to when we work together and when you're all about the strategy and the vision and you have to see the big picture and you want to talk and talk about that, but it's hard to kind of build a bridge
Hmm.
between that strategy, the big picture, and okay, how are we going
Yeah.
to implement this? What are the practical steps that need to be executed? It's sort of like
Hmm.
you either don't want to think about that, or you have a way of thinking about that that's for someone like me, self-pres dominant,
Hmm.
doesn't always
Hmm.
feel realistic. Let's put it that way. So it's
Right.
like
Yeah.
it's like
True.
too much theory and abstraction, and my head is over here and it's not kind of on the ground on where's my laptop, where's my wallet, where's my phone. It's like I notice as a self-preservation dominant over time, starting from maybe my 20s 30s, I really trained myself to like keep track of things and sort of be aware. And it's like you've never like to you training yourself to do that would seem boring and like a waste of
Mm.
time, because
Right.
your head is more engaged in what you're thinking about at a different level.
Interesting. And another feature is to be positive and optimistic. I think that it's also for other types, like all self-pres repressed tend to be more optimistic. Or you could
Mhm.
say less realistic. We don't measure um, risks as much as other people do. But
Right,
it's
right,
true
right.
that fives, especially, and let's say mental types in general, are way more distracted when they are self-pres repressed.
Right, right. I also think for a five, and this I know this is also Brazilian, but not being mindful of boundaries.
Hmm.
Which
Yeah,
again is a little bit like giving yourself away a little bit,
yeah,
not not noticing when it might be good to have more of a boundary between you and someone, but sort of being over generous or
yeah.
um, that something like that when it's to your detriment, that kind
Hmm.
of thing.
Yeah. Good. We could talk until tomorrow about self-pres repressed five. So let's move on to
Yes, yes.
sixes.
Okay.
My wife is a self-pres repressed six, and there is this interesting paradox
And
in
a social
which
six, we should say, because I
social
I
with,
was I
yeah,
was going to thinking about sexual six, and I think there
yeah,
may be again the three subtypes
yeah.
of six are so different. There may be some differences between social six and sexual six when self-pres is repressed. But say what you were going to say. Sorry, I
Yeah,
interrupted you.
I agree. I agree. And yeah, so she's self-pres repressed. And so there is this paradox in her of being concerned and many times looking at risks, even in daily life and health wise for the whole family and so forth, but being not very attentive to other kinds of risks that sound more basic to her, or
Mm,
even being a bit more disorganized and less concerned with everything going well on in details of daily processes of life.
Right.
And also there is a bit more paradox between being pessimistic and not as much at times.
Mm.
And also the thing about mm, trusting others is easier. It's not the
Yes.
person who's really cautious about trusting others there. And
Yeah.
yeah, actually I see that in practice there are many times that they over trust others, and I think the social
Yes.
dominant plays a role here. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I
interesting.
was I was thinking
Yeah.
that exact thing of like contrary to what you might expect, she's not very suspicious of other people. And she
Yeah.
gives people the benefit of the doubt. Like her assumption going in is positive,
hmm
whereas I think some sixes are a little bit more careful,
hmm
suspicious, looking for ulterior motives,
hmm
and which again can be a protective thing. So there can be but I do think
Yeah.
it's very paradoxical. On the one hand, the six is sort of making the person, looking out for risks and threats, managing risks and threats, but then in a certain, like you say, day-to-day level way or self-care way, like not seeing certain things that aren't good for them.
Yeah. And not only my wife, but other self-pressed, repressed sixes I know are very spontaneous, very spontaneous. They are, sometimes they say things before thinking, and they can be like a bit invasive even, in saying things that other people can be shocked. I think there is the
Mhm.
Brazilian side here also, but
Mhm.
yeah, that's what I see in practice. Yeah.
Well, thinking a little more about sexual sixes too, I think they can be self-pres repressed sixes can be the big risk takers, the
hmm
big contrarians, the big like jumping out of airplanes, getting a thrill out of danger.
hmm
The person who rides their motorcycle on the freeway and high speeds really dangerous. I think the sexual six with self-pres repressed is the biggest thrill seeker. Courting danger, not being aware. So because in a way, if what you were just describing, social six and self-pres repressed is a paradox, it's almost like sexual six is double six of the six that doesn't see fear. It's the fear is really repressed or in the blind spot. It's like much more of a rebel, a person who's even more like pushing back on authority in ways that put themselves in danger, being the activist, being the one who's fighting for the underdog in a way that puts themselves in that doesn't really consider their own sort of well-being and security.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So finally, sevens. Um, Self-pressed, repressed sevens become perhaps the most distracted of any type, and they become very disconnected from reality, prone to fantasies, to idealizations, and they also can't stop having ideas really, and it's harder to implement them. So it's a seven that also has a hard time being grounded like fives or fours, but it's not as much about being grounded. It's more like the the most clumsy of the whole Enneagram. I have a very, very close friend who's a self-pres repressed seven. I have a son also who's a self-pres repressed seven. And both of them, they have injuries that they have on themselves. They hurt themselves so often, but so often in so many different ways. I do too, by the way, but for them it's not to be compared with anyone else. and they run risks that are bad. Like my biggest concern with my son always has been he will be crossed over on the street because of how distracted he is, and then actually he ran this risk many times in practice. But also, self-pres repressed sevens are big risk takers. I think they are bold. They are even more innovative than sevens already are. They go for things and ideas they have that don't think twice, that don't measure consequences, and that unless they learn that with life, or unless they are making efforts to be this way, for instance, because of someone else. But they tend to be extremely prone to try things out, and sometimes in a reckless way. And at the same time, these are some of the funniest people that exist. And they're very entertaining, and the chaotic way of thinking and communicating gets even more exaggerated but also entertaining. It's like woo 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 woo, they go to all sides when they talk, and they mix up things even more than the average seven.
Yes, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about our friend Fergus,
Yeah.
and our partner in the CPS Enneagram Compass Enneagram test that we just created and finished, and it's ready for people who want to take it. He's very funny in his self-pres repression. He's a social seven, and he tells very funny stories, like the one he tells about how he showed up at like a music festival once in the UK, and it was one of these music festivals that's like out in the country where you camp and you have to bring all your stuff. And he showed up with like nothing, with like still wearing his soccer outfit from a game he was at 2 days before, and with no jacket and no tent, or no food, and he just sort of put himself out there like that. So I think they're like the most optimistic, the self preservation repressed, the most, like you said, idealistic. Like if they can think of something really positive, it's almost like that's the reality. There's no other side, there's no countervailing force inside them that's saying, well, what about this? Because the self-preservation seven is the one that is a little more anxious, a little more worried, a little bit more looking at what might go wrong. Whereas if you don't have that piece in you, you're missing that. You're a seven that's even more convinced that it's all going to go well, even when there's information out there that says that maybe it won't. So more daring, like you said, more anti-authoritarian, although they tend to be a little more subtle with it than the six or the sexual six. More adventurous, more excited about adventure, and not planning and not knowing what's going to happen, and sort of just having a overly optimistic view of everything turning out well and everything going right, even if might it might be in their best interest to think more deeply about that kind of thing.
Right, right. And I think that
Harder to see the negative data in the situation. Let's put it that way.
exactly.
Yeah.
And just one last comment from me. I think the self-pres repressed seven is the one that has uh, the biggest, the most messy hair.
You're just thinking about Fergus now.
Not only him, not only him. I have several people in mind when I say that, and I think there is a hard competition though between self-pres repressed sevens and self-pres repressed fives when it comes to messy hair. But
Yeah.
anyway, I think yeah, that is it. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Oh,
think
and
that
by the way, for
Einstein,
people,
I think that Einstein was a self-pres repressed, but either a 7 or a 5, but self-pres repressed in my view.
mm, hmm hmm hmm
Mhm.
okay. And if people, by the way, are wondering about our new CPS Enneagram test, which comes with a 20-page report once you when you get your results, you can purchase that on our website, cpenneagram.com, because I know if you've
Yeah,
heard us talking about that and you haven't heard about it before, you might be interested. So just wanted to
yeah.
give that extra piece of information
Yeah, I've
because
been
we're,
using it so much, and I'm so happy
yeah,
because it's helping me a lot. It's
yeah,
more and more accurate, and yeah, it's a great tool.
yeah. 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 Good. All right. So I think that's it for that, our discussion of the self-pres repressed instinct. So now it's time for our top five.
And what is our top 5 today, B?
So our top five today is the top five most naive types of people.
Oh, okay.
And I had a little bit of trouble with this one, but I think I'm ready.
Do you want to start?
Sure. And a little bit like you the last time, um,
I
I
know you
started
cheated. You
I
cheated
just
again.
well,
I
I only
know. Yeah.
I did a tie for number five.
Uh,
Actually, I had trouble thinking of five at first, but then I used
uh-huh.
subtype, and then it became a little more complicated, and I had more
I see.
options.
Uh-huh.
But I'm not too sure about this. But at number five, I put, um, well, actually, no. I'm going to say this. Um, Number five is not a tie. Number four is the tie. I'm just in the moment
Okay.
switching it because it seems
Great.
to make sense to
It's
me. So
flexible. Uh-huh.
my number five is nine, type nine.
Mm, okay.
And
Okay.
that's because I don't think nines are the most naive. I think you know, their attention is on what's going on out there. And so often they're tuning in to different things, and they can be pretty savvy and active in the world. But I think it's because for nines it's because of their positive outlook.
Hmm.
I think there's nines tend to be so positive about people, about things, that I think that's one of the things that can make them a little naive. It's almost like they don't they don't look for ulterior motives that much. I think maybe it's part of avoiding conflict, but it's like they're trying to see things in the best possible light. And I think that sometimes that makes them not see some of the things out there that they might tune into if they were uh, less that way.
Okay, my number 5 is type 5. And I
Mm,
don't like that I have position 5 on number 5, but I needed to be true to what I was thinking. I wanted 5 to be way higher on the list, being like number 1 or 2,
hmm
because I am extremely naive. I think it's one of my chief features.
Yeah.
But I must say that it's not what happens with most 5s.
hmm
Many other 5s are better than I am in mapping out problems, and they don't find it as easy to trust others as I do.
hmm
And they don't have the same issues I do on all things we talked
hmm
about, but
Right.
it's the self-preservation repressed. And I think the 5 with the social dominant with self-pres repressed, like me, tends to be very naive, but not
Yeah.
other instinctual sequences of 5s. So this is
Yeah.
my number 5.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. And my number four is a tie between two subtypes. So it's a twice over cheating.
Hmm.
And that is a tie between social five and social one.
Mm.
And it's interesting. I was thinking about five, but then I thought of one of my best friends who's a self preservation five. And she's probably the least naive person I know. Like
Hmm.
she is really like she she's got an amazing spidey sense for really seeing like what's going on out there with people. You know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
nothing gets by her, right? So when I thought of that, I thought, I can't really put five there. But social five, I
mm,
think, is a different story. I think social fives, again, for some of the reasons we talked about in the podcast, especially if self-preservation is repressed. But I also think social ones, interestingly, are
tell me about it. Yeah,
naive. And that's because, and partly I'm thinking of my brother, but I'm also thinking of even both my father and my brother are social ones, but other social ones. And I think this is because they get really focused on their vision of what's true or what's right, and it's sort of like they feel really confident in that, and they sort of they're a little, they hold themselves a little bit out of the group, which is and this, by the way, you know how sometimes there's a social subtype sometimes gets described as navigating.
yeah,
Like, I always think of social one, and because there's not as much navigate, they're not navigating what's going on in this sort of savvy way. It's almost like they get like a little bit of a utopian worldview that comes out of their right way of seeing things.
yeah, yeah.
Like, this is the way it is, right? And
Hmm.
it's like either they don't see other possibilities or they just think it's wrong, you know? That, and it's just like, okay, the person's just mistaken. But it's almost like they get a little bit more, too much of a sense of seeing things in one way and a little naive to the ways other people actually are,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah,
And I think
interesting.
it's
Yeah.
because this sort of utopian belief in the right or the best way to do things, and they're focused on that so much.
Mm.
Like my father, like he doesn't, like he would never gossip about someone. He would never. He doesn't really dwell on sort of some of the negative things out there in the world. He more like really focuses on what the right thing is in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I'm making this too personal, but
I like
go ahead.
that. I hadn't thought of ones for this list.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, my number four is seven.
Hmm.
And I originally had put seven higher up on the list, but then it really depends on subtype. I think self-pressed sevens are not naive at all,
Mhm.
and self-pressed repressed fives are, especially social, I think, but also sexual. So sevens can be very naive, but not all sevens are. So it's my number three.
Mhm. Mm. Number three, huh? What was your
Yeah.
number four?
Sevens. Yeah,
Oh,
my number
oh,
four,
I
not
thought
not my number
your
three.
number
Yeah,
four. Oh,
sorry.
okay. Okay.
So what is your third? Your
So
number
my third is eight. Self-pres repressed eight, especially.
3.
I think eights can be naive, not always. I think there are some eights that tune into like the politics of things, but I think a lot of eights kind of just see things their way and don't always, and because they're so authentic and straightforward, they don't imagine the other what people are like not being like that.
Mm. Yeah, makes sense. And eights are also my number three. And I said eights in general, really. Although I think that the sexual and the social are more so than self-press, and similar reasons than the ones you said.
Yeah, yeah.
So what is your
Wow. Well,
second?
I'm really interested in hearing what your one and two are because you've exhausted all the possibilities in my view.
Aha, yeah.
Well, my second, and here I did cheat and use subtypes. I'm just going to say my second and my first because they're
Mm-hmm.
related. So my second
Mm-hmm.
is social seven, and my first is sexual seven.
Okay, choose subtypes of
I
seven.
think sexual seven is by far the most naive. And I think they will tell you
Uh-huh.
that too. Like, I remember there was at one of as an example, there was a student in one of our courses who gave the example that he was in Paris and he had been there for like a week or two and it was his last day and he had like, you know, he had some money left, not that much. And he saw one of these street artists with that shell game.
Yeah.
And he thought, oh, I can figure that out. And he put like all the rest of his money betting on where the ball was under which shell. And of course he lost, but those things are rigged. If for a lot of people would say those are rigged, but he said he was so naive that he thought he was going to win money and he lost his last bit of money.
Hmm. I remember
Anyway,
that
there's a lot of
story.
examples, sexual sevens. And then I think
Yeah.
social sevens too, because I think social sevens are similar, but I totally agree with you that self-preservation sevens are not naive.
Yeah, probably I think you are convincing me that sevens should be a bit higher up for me. But my number two is nine. I think I see more naivete on nines than
Mm,
you.
yeah,
Although there is this paradox that sometimes body types are less naive because they can smell things, But
the gut instinct. Yeah.
the gut feeling, yeah. But I think that nines can be quite naive, and especially if you disconsider that first impression they may have of instinct, because they end up going along with trusting and doing things and putting themselves in danger because of naivete. But you're probably curious about what my number one is. And
Yes.
it is the self-pres repressed in all types. I just wanted
Ah,
to,
that's a cheat. That's a cheat.
yes,
Yeah.
I wanted to pay tribute to this podcast, of
Ah, I
self-pres
see.
repressed people. But I do think
I
that
see.
there is a correlation between the self-preservation repressed and people being naive.
Yes.
That's it.
Okay, that's it. So we thank you for listening and watching because we're on YouTube now, as well as on audio and podcast platforms formations. And so we have to make sure our hair looks a little bit better than usual. But we thank you for listening. We hope you join us again for the Enneagram 2.0 podcast where we talk about all things Enneagram.